ear. You have incredibly great background in social justice. So Daniel is the coordinator of the Tennessee Interfaith Power and Light, and he also is the coordinator of the Creation Care Ministry of the Tennessee Conference of United Methodist Church, and the founder of Earth Keepers, which is hosted by the United Methodist Global Ministries. And the Earth Keepers is basically a training program that equips US-based United Methodists to launch and grow environmental projects in their communities. In eco-theology and anti-racism, community organizing, and project planning. He's an adjunct professor at the Vanderbilt Divinity School and teaches things like sustainable community development, nonviolent social movements, and restorative justice. Can we all take these courses with you, please? They sound fantastic. And you recently stopped, Daniel recently stopped coordinating courses for the Divinity School at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, which is for high-risk male offenders and includes inmates on death row. That sounds like amazing work. He got his PhD in resource development from Michigan State University and a master's in divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological School. So I also want to point out this point that we had in your introduction, that you lived in an intentional community called Nashville Greenlands, which is part of the Catholic worker movement. Looking forward to hearing more about that, maybe in the question and answer period. So it's great to see everybody here. And with that, we turn it over to Dan.
Well, welcome everybody from the Nashville Greenlands here, Catholic worker community. I'm going to talk, it's kind of a two-part presentation, a little bit reflection on John Lewis, and then really talking about organizing in the spirit of John Lewis. And I'm going to share a story that I was involved with of an organizing campaign for energy justice, really some of the roots of energy justice. And I think it's very much in the spirit of John Lewis. And I think it's important to tell and repeat these stories of ordinary people, taking on powers to bring about energy justice. John Lewis had very important Nashville ties. He was a student at American Baptist Seminary, training for the ministry. When he got involved with the campaign for desegregating the downtown businesses in Nashville, and Nashville was actually the first southern city to desegregate its businesses, battling Jim Crow. And his formation came from a strong sense of duty formed in the Black church in the community in rural Troy, Alabama. And again, he was a key leader in what's often been called the model civil rights campaign, the sit-in struggle here in Nashville. People aren't as aware of sometimes the Nashville campaign, but it really catalyzed the whole freedom civil rights movement. It was kind of in a lull for a long period of time after the Montgomery bus boycott. And Nashville really catalyzed the movement. In fact, there's a book I recommend to everybody called The Children by David Halberstam. And it's a wonderful book that tells the story and the young people that were at the forefront of the sit-in movement. It started out with some trainings at Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, about a mile and a half from where I live here in North Nashville. James Lawson was one of the really unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. He was the core trainer for nonviolence in Nashville and throughout the South. And he was also a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where I currently teach. And he came out to teach nonviolence at one of my Riverbend courses at the prison a few years back. And so I've continued to work with James Lawson, but he really took these students and put them through a very intensive training in what's called Satyagraha, or Truth Force, the Gandhian nonviolence. And both the philosophy of it, the spiritual foundations of it, and the tactics of nonviolence. Lawson was trained in nonviolence in India. And so he really has roots in Gandhian nonviolence. And I'm going to share a quote from John Lewis's. It's another great book, John Lewis's autobiography, Walking with the Wind. It's another book I would strongly recommend reading. But the quote, and sorry, I'm kind of flipping pages. It's one of the challenges of Zoom a little bit. John Lewis says, "Heaven and earth." And he's talking about these trainings from James Lawson. "This was the social gospel in action. This was love in action, or what we came to call in our workshops soul force. Jim Lawson knew, though we had no idea when we began, that we were being trained for a war unlike any this nation had seen up to this time, a nonviolent struggle that would force this country to face its conscience. Lawson was arming us, preparing us, planting in us a sense of both rightness and righteousness, soul force that would see us through the ugliness and pain that lay ahead, all in pursuit of something both he and Dr. King called the beloved community. This idea, beyond any other, was the fulcrum of all that Jim Lawson was teaching us. It was at the center as well of everything that Dr. King was working toward. As both men understood it, and as we were taught to believe in our workshops, the beloved community was nothing less than the Christian concept of the kingdom of God on earth. According to this concept, all human existence throughout history, from ancient Eastern and Western societies up through the present day, has striven towards community, toward coming together. That movement is as inexorable, as irresistible as the flow of a river towards the sea. Whenever it is interrupted or delayed by forces that would resist it, by evil or hatred, by greed, by the lust for power, by the need for revenge, believers in the beloved community insist it is their moral responsibility of men and women with soul force, people of goodwill, to respond and to struggle nonviolently against the forces that stand between a society and the harmony it naturally seeks. These were incredibly powerful ideas, and their beauty was they applied to real life and to the specifics of the world we walked in. They applied to Bird's drugstore and to the Troy Theater. They applied to the buses I rode to high school and to the all-Black classes in which I sat. They applied to the men and women who refused to serve Black people at the lunch counters of downtown Nashville. They applied to the admissions office at Troy State University. There were fewer than 10 of us at those first meetings, but soon the number began to grow. And out of this came the sit-ins in downtown Nashville, sitting at the lunch counters in downtown Nashville, and you know, hundreds of young people participated in it. There were ruffians that you know, beat up the people that were sitting in. They were spat on. They were mustard was poured on, ketchup was poured on their heads. They were arrested, and so this was a very intensive campaign. But again, through this training and the discipline and the soul force that they had, they stood together. It was also very much rooted in the Black church here in North Nashville, and you know, powerful worship services in support of the sit-in people. And the community also partaken of a boycott of the downtown businesses throughout all of this. And you know, it was a very intensive campaign in downtown Nashville. And it culminated with a bombing. It was a bombing of Alexander Luby home. It's just a few blocks actually from where I live here in North Nashville. He was a prominent civil rights lawyer. And the attempt was, by bombing his home, this would intimidate people, because of course, segregation and Jim Crow and discrimination, particularly in the South, was always based in terror. I mean, people aren't going to take that kind of you know, treatment unless you know, there's serious force behind it. But instead of intimidating the community, it basically catalyzed the community. The next morning, they were wondering if anybody was going to show up. They announced a march to the Metro Courthouse, where the mayor's office is, and 5,000 people showed up, and they marched silently down to the Metro Courthouse. And Diane Nash, who was, again, one of the very important leaders of the sit-in campaign, was designated to confront the mayor. And she confronted the mayor and asked him whether he would support and call for the desegregation of businesses. And he said, well, kind of condescendingly at first, young lady, I already desegregated the airport. And she said, well, are you then going to desegregate downtown Nashville? And yes, he said, I think that's the moral thing to do. And so quickly the downtown stores desegregated. And this was a major victory for civil rights in the South. Again, the first Southern city to desegregate its downtown stores. John Lewis went on. He became the chairperson of SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was the kind of the parallel arm to the the SCLC, Martin Luther King's, but it was the kind of the young arm of that. But they also had a great deal of independence. He participated in the Freedom Ride, where the buses, where they were desegregating the buses into South and into Alabama. The first riders were beat up brutally, and then a second bus got through. Participated in the march and spoke at the March on Washington, of course, with Martin Luther King. He was a leader in the Birmingham struggle, where really this movement really escalated. You've all seen the clips on TV of the dogs attacking the protesters and the bombing of the 16th Avenue Church there. He was a key leader in the Freedom Summer in Mississippi, where they really confronted terror, where civil rights activists were murdered, churches were burned, and he finally participated in the March on Selma, which I've often called, the march over the River Jordan, where they had the great breakthrough, and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was passed. And so John Lewis was one of the inspirational leaders of that movement, but a quiet leader, not one that, went for the limelight, as really most of the leaders that came out of that Nashville struggle were quiet leaders and very persistent leaders and very confident leaders and they believed deeply in satyagraha, or soul force, and the spiritual force of nonviolence. And so they carried this through from their rather, humble beginnings of 10 people meeting in a Methodist church in North Nashville into being, really some of the key, key participants in breaking down the Jim Crow and the voting discrimination and all of that, and bringing national legislation forward to move our nation forward. John Lewis, of course, went on to be a congressperson, and an important congressperson, and we're all aware of his life there. And so he believed in in good policy too, and fought for good policy, and was a fighter for energy justice in the legislature. And all of this has continued on in Nashville. I'm not going to tell this story, but I was a participant and a key participant and a mentor and a strategist for the longest sit-in campaign in the nation's history. It was around 10 healthcare cutoffs in Tennessee. And it was largely people that were affected by these, by the healthcare cuts. TennCare was kind of our Medicare, Medicaid program here in Tennessee, kind of prior to the Affordable Care Act. And it was, again, led by people largely affected by it. People like Glenn Barnhill, who was on a ventilator in a wheelchair, and others with serious disabilities or health conditions. And that sit-in lasted from June 20th, which happens to be my birthday, to September 14th. and folks were sitting at the state capitol to protest these cuts. The Tennessean editorial, this is from the Tennessean: the vigil kept this week by TennCare protesters might be futile and it might be desperate, but it's certainly understandable. The protesters, many of whom are themselves on TennCare, help remind the governor of all of Tennessee of the stakes as the administration moves forward with its plans. To these individuals and their families, TennCare reform isn't a calculated policy decision. It's a life-altering, perhaps life-ending problem. And again, we were down there for, for the pretty much the whole summer and into the fall. And basically you could go in and out during the day. But when you were there at night, and we had candlelight vigils out there, and congregations throughout the area participated. We had a bell ringing where we were out ringing a bell for every 10 people that were cut off. The 300,000, the really 700,000 people that had prescription drug cutbacks, and the 300,000 from TennCare. We had a bell ringing for every 10 people, and we had people from every county in Tennessee come in to ring bells for the people in their county. And so it was a very powerful thing to be a part of. And we ended up with a partial victory. It was a hard struggle, but we got in the announcement about 100,000 people with chronic conditions would be retained on TennCare. And then there was a whole portfolio of programs to assist with prescription drugs and covering the kids that were cut off and make sure that they were covered for businesses. And so we were able to build around a safety net around a lot of these people that were cut off. And so it was a major campaign, a partial victory. But then a lot of these people continued on in the struggle for healthcare. And Tennessee congressional votes were, we had some swing voters here in Tennessee in the Congress, and we were able to carry those Democrats, those swing Democrats, and help get the Affordable Care Act pulled through. Just a quote from The Nation magazine. The protest was the best thing I put effort into my life, says TennCare enrollee Glenn Barnhill, a 45-year-old from Nashville who stocked grocery shelves at Kroger before he was rendered a quadriplegic from a gunshot wound to his brain. If we don't keep fighting, Barnhill says, between puffs on his ventilator, these people are going to die. So again, it was a fundamental struggle, and it's part of the inspiration of the Nashville sit-ins, that this tradition has continued on strongly here in Nashville. It's really kind of part of our DNA here in Nashville. I'm gonna kind of switch to Chicago. We're gonna go way north and back to some of the beginnings of the struggle for energy justice. I was a community organizer in Chicago starting in 1984 with the Northwest Community Organization. And it was an organization actually founded by Saul Alinsky, and some of you may have heard his name. He's kind of the founder of much of the philosophy of community organizing around the country. And the Northwest Community Organization was one of the 3 organizations actually founded by Saul Alinsky in Chicago. And it was founded in 1963. And it was a very powerful organization. It worked hard to, Chicago's the most segregated city in the United States. And Westtown, where NCO is one of the few integrated neighborhoods in in Chicago, at least at the in the 70s and 80s. And the organization had a lot to do with that. In fact, there was one census tract. I mean, it was unusual for our community, but there was one census tract that had 1/3 whites, 1/3 blacks, and 1/3 Latinx folks. So in many respects, our organization was a representative of the beloved community, an interracial organization, an organization largely led by modest income people. Often many low income people or the modest income people who lived in the community. The community transformed itself from being primarily Polish and Ukrainian American into a mixed community, with probably at the heart of the Puerto Rican community in Chicago was in our community. It led to, there was bank redlining, where basically banks were not investing in what are called blighted communities. And that included communities within Westtown, and the organization united with people on the West Side and all around Chicago, and eventually led to national legislation, the Community Reinvestment Act, that bans redlining across the country. And that came out of our community, as did legislation to make it much more difficult for arson for profit, which was hugely affecting communities in the 1970s, particularly in our community. And so there were just numerous victories won by this organization. So we knew what we were doing. The people knew what they were doing. And I came in as a young organizer in 1984, and this was my first campaign. And we were suffering a huge utility shutoff crisis in Illinois. It was a recession, and hundreds of thousands of, over 100,000 families in Illinois were being shut off every year. And you can imagine what it's like in Chicago, one of the coldest cities in the United States, to be without heat in the winter. Or Chicago can be one of the hotter cities in the United States in the summer. There wasn't a lot of air conditioning actually in Chicago. People relied on fans, particularly in our neighborhood, but to have no cooling, and if your electricity was shut off. And so this again was a life or death struggle for a lot of people. And so at our office, we came up with a plan, largely with our utility committees and a group out in South Austin, and a group on the South Side called ACE came up with a plan where people would pay a percentage of their income for gas and lights. And if they paid that percentage of income, at that time it was 12%. It's now down to like 10 in Illinois. It was 12%. If they did that, they wouldn't have their gas and lights shut off. And so that may sound like a lot of money, but if you're getting, several $100 utility bills and your income is almost, very low income, it was a big help to folks. And so we came up with this plan, and it seemed like a very radical plan, and one that was very unlikely that we were going to win. We brought it to a case at the Illinois Commerce Commission, which was the commission that regulates the utilities in Illinois. And so we presented it with a legal case. We had legal sponsorship from the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic. The structure of the campaign, we had a strategy committee that met weekly, at least weekly, from the various coalitions, organizations that we built into this. And we had also a local committee in our organization working on this, largely from low-income people affected by this. And there was a lot of, we would debate and hash out strategy, but there was a lot of trust developed within this campaign. We brought it to the Illinois Commerce Commission. There were 4 Republicans on the commission and 3 Democrats. Phil O'Connor was the chairperson. He had been the campaign chair for the Republican governor, James Thompson. Started off with a press conference in June. And then there was a first hearing in August at the Illinois Commerce Commission. So we mobilized people from throughout our neighborhood and the other core neighborhoods. We actually do a bus caravan around the neighborhood and pick people up at parishes, and it's a very Catholic community, parishes, and run cars out and pick people up and bring them to the buses. We'd have to do this all in about a half an hour time, get people loaded up at between 9 and 9:30, load them up, get them downtown by 10 o'clock for the hearing. But we filled a busload for the first case hearing in August. And at that hearing, the Illinois Commerce Commission agreed to 3 community hearings on the issue. The first one was in our neighborhood, and this was a great opportunity to build the base for our campaign. We had several hundred people show up for our hearing, really gripping testimony about how this affected their lives, having their heat shut off or their electricity shut off, very gripping testimony. And then in late October, we found out there was going to be a new energy center out at Northwestern University, which is on the north side in the suburbs out there. And we found out that the governor was going to be speaking there. And we thought, well, maybe we want to get the governor's support for this because, he appoints this commission. So we brought 5 bus loads out to the northern suburbs, and all these dignitaries were sitting in this tent. And we got these 5 bus loads of people out and surrounded the tent and negotiated with the governor's staff. And the governor said he would meet with us right after they had like this balloon, big balloon and ribbon cutting ceremony. And so he brought us all into the tent. He had never heard of this issue before, but agreed to meet with our leadership in a week, which he did. And he then endorsed the plan, which was huge. Now we had some real legitimacy around this. And again, this was a Republican governor, Jim Thompson, the late Jim Thompson. We built a very substantial endorsement list around this, hundreds of organizations, everything from the Archdiocese of Chicago to the League of Women Voters to most of the denominations, the mainstream denominations, to the March of Dimes. So we had a big endorsement list. We did a church letter writing campaign. But then it started getting towards the colder weather. In late November, there was a testimony at one of our hearings about a family that couldn't cook their Thanksgiving meal because of this. And so we decided to present a frozen turkey to Phil O'Connor, the chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. So that was our media action there. It was a serious action, that families couldn't cook, but it was also kind of implying he was a turkey, so for not supporting the plan. So we used a lot of humor. Basically, the humor was partly a media stunt, but also just there's a lot of anger out there in terms of people are suffering greatly. And so as a community organizer, you also kind of have to do things to actually kind of diffuse the anger and get people to be able to participate in a way that doesn't just kind of blow up the campaign. And so at Christmas, we presented the Illinois Commerce Commission with a block of ice and a stocking and sang Christmas carols with the words changed to be about heat shutoffs, frozen hands, frozen feet to Silent Night, for instance. By December, though, it was getting very intense. We needed to get people's heat turned on even before we get this plan passed. So we found out that the Illinois Commerce Commission was going to have a Christmas party. So we decided to show up. We showed up actually an hour early. We weren't actually going to disrupt their party, but we hang shut off notices on their little Christmas tree that they had at the party. And out of this, they agreed to a shut off reconnection day. So we got thousands of families across the state reconnected in this effort. And in January, a woman on the west side died. She froze to death. We debated this, whether to do this or not, but we decided to do a mock funeral down at the Illinois Commerce Commission. And our then president of NCO, Dorothy Maida, challenged Phil O'Connor, who came down to talk to us. And it resulted in him driving around our community with Dorothy and myself to visit families that had been cut off. And this made it real to him. I still can remember the baby sitting in a crib, in a cold room, and you could, kind of see the breath in the air. And this affected him. It made it personal to him. And he, slowly became a supporter of the program. He was kind of deeply moved. We continued on getting endorsements of the Chicago City Council that endorsed it unanimously. We developed support for the campaign from around the state, the Southern Counties Action Movement down in Southern Illinois, East St. Louis, Peoria. And finally, in March, there was going to be a hearing in Springfield, which is 4 hours away. That's the state capital is 4 hours from Chicago. And they alternate the hearings from Chicago and Springfield. And so we had to get folks up around 3:30 in the morning on the buses at 4:30 in the morning. So you can imagine the sacrifice that people did to get down there. And we filled the room. They were very surprised to see us. And they passed a modified version of the plan. It was basically the 12%, but then people they'd be responsible for what was called the shortfall, the difference that would be kind of always, hanging over them. They wouldn't have to pay it to keep their utilities on, but they would be responsible for it. So we debated whether this was a victory or not. And we decided it gave us a certain amount of legitimacy moving forward, but we needed more. And eventually, the Democratic whip in the state Senate, John Joranko, introduced our original plan into the state Senate. And he's a powerful guy. And he got it passed through his Senate committee, 31-20. Got it passed through his committee, and it passed the Senate pretty quickly, 31-28, all Democrats in favor, all Republicans against. And we were in new ground here. We weren't really used to working the state legislature. Springfield's a long ways away. We had to learn how to lobby, but we did a very extensive campaign, talking to all the legislatures around the state. We had a very powerful sponsor in the House, Jim McPike, who was Mike Madigan's right-hand man. And again, the state legislature is run pretty powerfully by Mike Madigan at that time, the Democrat. So we had strong support on the Democratic side, and it passed with some bipartisan support in the House. Now the governor had to sign the bill. The rubber hit the road. There's some talk that the only reason that the legislature passed it was to pass the buck along to the governor, and he wasn't ever going to sign this thing. And he strung us out. He strung us out despite his previous support, okay? And we were getting close to the period where this thing was gonna just die because, he could just not sign it. But we also found out his campaign schedule. He was running for re-election. And so we would show up at his campaign stops. And this was pre-9/11, well before 9/11. We even caught him out in the airport going on a junket to Paris. And that was a great press action, governor going out to Paris, neglecting folks that are shut off in Illinois. So he finally agreed to meet with us a few days before about a week before the signing deadline. We had several hundred people to rally there. Lucy Soto, our new president, who had been one of the primary leaders of this, chaired the meeting. And we presented our case, and he said he'd make his decision in a week. Okay, and so we had some hope. And so we mobilized. We had 800 people for a noontime rally with this big bus caravan and out the state of Illinois Center. And they brought us all into this massive auditorium. And the governor said that he found money to pay for the plan, $100 million to pay for the plan for 3 years. Through what were called these oil overcharge funds, and he was going to sign it. And this place just went electric. This was one of the most joyous days of many of our lives, seeing this. But now, the story has a lot of twists and turns because the governor added this funding to it. It was now called what's an amendatory veto. It had to go back to the state legislature. And now the powerful Illinois Commerce Commission and the Illinois Manufacturing Association said that this was the plan they most wanted to defeat. This was the bill they most wanted to defeat in that legislative session. And so suddenly we're up against some pretty powerful forces. We got it, again, Joranko got it through his Senate committee. It went before the state Senate. We sent down our lobbying team, including myself, the day before. And they were able to really target 3 Democrats to say, you know, you're not going to get reelected. We're going to put all our forces against you if you support this, a couple vulnerable ones. So they were just going to vote present. But we were becoming a little bit of a moral force in Springfield, a moral force across the state. And so we actually had 10 Republicans lined up to support this thing. Jesse Jackson was down there speaking. He spoke in favor of it. And right afterwards, I pulled out this legislature. You send in a card and the legislator comes out and talks to you. And he was talking to myself and Lucy. And he said, his name was Custra, Robert Custra. And a Republican, he said, well, I really want to support this thing, but Paige Phillip, our caucus chairperson, is going to caucus the Republicans. And if he does that, we're all going to have to vote against it. So after all of this work and all of this hope, we're down to that. And so we go, you know, we were actually sleeping on the floor of a church in Springfield and, you know, praying and hoping that we can get this thing through. We had met the night before with the governor's lobbyist, Zach Stamp, and he said, well, the governor's already done all he can do for you. And so we decided, well, what are we going to do? He said, well, we found out that the governor was going to be signing some bills at the state legislature. And so we showed up for that. And, you know, I had this kind of handwritten thing that Lucy and I put together. You know, we have these 10 legislators in favor. We also had several busloads of people come down. And so we had them all packed out in front of the governor. And we handed this thing to the governor's staff person. And the governor said, well, I'll take it to the governor, but he's not going to meet with you. He comes out with a sheepish grin on his face afterwards. He says, well, the governor will meet with the leadership right after he signs these bills. And so he signs the bills. Lucy talks to him. Lucy Soto talks to him. And he bounds up the stairs of the state legislature. He never does this, onto the floor of the state legislature and lobbies for the bill. And once he got on the floor, Paige Phillip was not going to cross him. They didn't like each other. They were kind of adversaries. But he couldn't go against a governor of his own party once he was on the floor of the legislature. And we got this passed. 3 years later, the governor appointed a legislative task force to renew the bill. Everybody decided this thing was working, and it passed unanimously through the state legislature with the utility support, because it was serving the utilities, it was serving and all those people that were shut off. And so that's a story of a campaign, very much, I think, in the spirit of John Lewis, that the direct action. We didn't get arrested. We had low-income people that weren't in a position to do so, but we were able to be a real moral soul force, I think, you know, to move mountains and to get this campaign through. So just to conclude, you know, John Lewis, the spirit of John Lewis, this non-sectarian, spiritual and principled sense of duty, a strong commitment to the method and spirit of nonviolence. I think our campaign was always nonviolence. We treated officials with respect, even though we used humor. We treated officials with respect, and we were a moral force. Disciplined action, direct action, a beloved interracial and diverse community, and governance that serves the social good and serves social justice. Those are all the prime principles of John Lewis's life. And I think this campaign also exemplified that. And so, again, I think there's a lot of power in all of this. There's a lot of power in ordinary people in a disciplined, form of nonviolence. And, Westtown was a very spiritual community, one of the most church communities I've ever been in. And that was very much a kind of some of the foundations of what we did. And so John Lewis ends his autobiography with this. There is an old African proverb: when you pray, move your feet. As a nation, if we care for the beloved community, we must move our feet, our hands, our hearts, our resources to build and not to kill. In the final analysis, we are one people, one family, one house, the American house, the American family. So I'll conclude with that quote and we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you so much, Dan. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hands in the video or in the participant window, or you can put them in the chat if you're more comfortable. Sarah?
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Dan. It was actually something I thought of before you spoke. And just wanted to hear your thoughts about about sort of Christian behavior that can be, that can not be as supportive toward environmental issues as it could be in certain denominations in particular. There are very progressive denominations that are concerned about social justice and the environment. There are Catholic activists who are very concerned. But there are many conservative ones across the country that don't seem to have that on their radar. And there's so much segregation within the Christian community, and I'm speaking as an Episcopalian. I just was curious to hear from all your experience, if you have sort of thoughts about that and how we can. It seems that a lot of change could occur if hearts were softened in some of these churches.
Yeah,
some of these congregations.
Yeah, it's in our campaign, it was very much a moral force. I mean, it was a different time, and the party divisions were different. But you notice in my story that it was many Republicans that came through for us. So, so I think it's really. I always believe in people speaking to people's better angels. I mean, part of what nonviolence does is also demonstrate, some of the violence and terror behind things that are segregation. But I also believe in speaking to people's better angels. And when, again, speaking to Christian audiences, leading from, particularly more evangelical audiences, I think that you're speaking of, leading from Scripture, leading from the heart, telling your story and how you got there, and speaking to people's moral centers, and also finding ways that I think that, interestingly enough, when I go speak in more conservative places, I'll often talk about my grandfather or that generation that conserved and was frugal, and speaking to people's community values. And so, and respect, again, is a key to all of this. When I get the climate denier, in a talk, I won't say, well, it's okay that you have that position, but I will very much listen to what they're saying, acknowledge what the points that I can agree with, make it very clear that I hear them, and just say, then this is what the science tells me. And, not saying that you're dumb for holding this other position, but this is what the science tells me. So I think the respect, and we're in a very fractured society right now. as you all know. I mean, it's just, it pains me to see how fractured as a society is that we are. But again, nonviolent techniques, and I also teach restorative justice at the prisons, and again, kind of build beloved community in those prisons in many respects. And it's an interracial, and I'm bringing in Divinity students. If you build around respect, you build around restorative values of listening, listening more than speaking, speaking from the heart. And when you do share strong faith traditions, drawing on that, I think a lot of that can go a long way. Yeah, I'll just tell the story of my uncle. He's not on the Zoom, so my uncle's, I love my uncle dearly, but he's also Mr. Fox News. But he salvages houses for, he used to actually, he can move houses, and he actually did that, and, he's had a lifetime of salvaging stuff. In fact, the little private drive that goes into his house is called Salvage Lane. And I one time I just said to him at Thanksgiving, I can think of few more environmentally conscious things than salvaging. And the next Thanksgiving, he said, at some point, he just said, conservatives can be environmentalists too. Yeah. So I think that it's a long answer, but I think that, drawing our restorative values in our nonviolent and in our spiritual cores, whatever our spiritual core may be, I think speaks a long way. That's the theory of nonviolence. I mean, it's really, it's become just thought of as a little bit of a tactic or getting arrested, but the core of it, the core of the Gandhian tradition is really speaking soul to soul and speaking truth to truth and awakening the truth in the other. And so that's the core of it. And so if one can practice it, I think it's a powerful thing. So, yeah.
Can I ask a practical question? I mean, how did you build a campaign that was explicitly nonviolent? Like, that doesn't just happen automatically. There's so many different ways of organizing. So were there like people leading the campaign that were trained in Kenyan nonviolence, or did you have training for the people that were involved?
In the sit-in campaign, yes. Yeah, we had, in fact, my housemate here, he knew Dorothy Day very well, Carl Meyer, and so he was one of the trainers of it. And so he trained the folks that were in the original sit-in, in these tactics. In Chicago, I think that it was just in the religious DNA of the organization. Again, our leadership, these were very quietly spiritual people, many of them. And it didn't mean that they never got angry at a hearing or something, but it did mean that they came out of a sense of mercy and respect and a kind of a Christian patience to it. And so, and we'd also just, we had a tone, and the tone was there. I do believe in having conversations around spiritual nonviolence, and I think that practically that's the way to go. But it was just in our Chicago campaign. I think it was just in the kind of the tone of the organizations that had built over time. So yeah.
I just want to say thank you for this talk. I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it will be more about environment, but it came to be a little bit more social economy. So that was actually good. And I just want to point out, I really appreciate you mentioning about the spiritual character, the virtues. Mm-hmm. For many of us who have a religious background, that speaks volumes, because you would say, oh, it's written, this is how it's written, but how is it done? Right? Mm-hmm. So it's a total different dynamics and totally different appreciation of things. I am a strong believer in the beloved community, no matter how people say that. And like you already mentioned, that we have different backgrounds, right? So we come to certain understanding from certain ways. So all that it tells me, and I hope I can reiterate this again, is that this is possible. No matter how hard it is, no matter how many, but it's like you mentioned about Dr. King. Actually, when I was in Rhode Island, we did that nonviolence training with the URI and stuff. And I'm super happy to know how many people who came from that civil rights movement who are still doing things that are positive for this country. Like it's crazy how this happens, but you know, you might say, oh, those negative events that happen, like, you know, many, like, I don't know, what is it, 1960s? So this would be what, 50, 67 years back? And it's like so many things that are coming from it. It's amazing. I'm really excited about it. So thank you very much. There's a quote that I like. I'm going to leave it in the chat and I'll let other people speak, because you know.
Why don't you tell your quote rather than leave it in the chat? Go ahead.
Well, it's not really my quote. It's just like, I like it. That's why I have it to say it. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. So the task that is the hardest is to have the consultation, right? The consultation of the opposites.
Thank you for your sharing.
So the truth comes when we actually can consult and bring out those jewels.
I'd like you to put it in the chat also, so I can think about it better.
Okay, sure.
Yeah,
if you wouldn't mind.
Yes. And again, thank you for inviting me.
Christine?
You're
muted.
Mila reminded me of the question I had, because what you just said fits well with Dan's statement about and concern about the fracturing of our society. So I have a real question. I do not have an answer. So it's a very sincere question. And maybe you have so much experience and you may be able to help shed light on how to do this. How can we get into conversation with people who think differently than we do? Like Mila talked about consultation, like that we can, like you talked with your uncle, but you had a chance to be with your uncle because he is your uncle. But you know, the neighbor down the street, or you know, how do you have any experience in your personal life or in your community? Have you been able to reach out, or how could we do this as Ripple? I mean, how can we reach out to people who are different? Do you have any thought?
Yeah, I don't have magic answers.
I don't expect any magic answers, just some, you know, things we can think about.
Yeah, well, number one rule is stay off social media. It's not a place for a conversation, seriously. I almost stay off it entirely, except for announcing events and things like that. But I actually think that's one of the things that's really fracturing us, because I think we're living through the media. We're not living in relationship with each other anymore. And that includes social media. I think the key is getting to know people. If people know that you support them as a person, that goes a long ways. And the other key is, I think, again, trying to identify commonalities, identify those moral commonalities and build on them rather than trying to overcome the difference first. And so, again, and just presenting yourself as a sincere person. Again, those might all sound like platitudes because I don't have the practical, you know, this is the formula you do it. Although there are groups around. I know the Minnesota IPL has done great work around climate conversations and things like that. And so there are some trainings and techniques that you can use to do that with things like climate, to have those conversations. But the key seems to be speaking out of your own experience, because it's hard for people to challenge your own experience. And then listening to the other's experience, it seems to be the core of it. And then resonating with those things that you can, but you don't have to, you know, it's both important to hold on to your core value and not compromise on that, at the same time hearing other people's cores. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. I mean, again, there are various techniques and dialogue circles that are kind of built to do these types of things. If you want to, you know, there's restorative circle processes and things, healing processes, that dialogue processes that you can kind of do that, but just in a more less systematic way. Again, it's just kind of holding to those restorative respect values in the conversation with each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to follow up on that, because I find myself these days, you know, even as minister, leaning less towards faith and more towards organizing for systemic change. You know, the way you talk about John Lewis and your own work, which is great. And it sounds like you won in part because you endured, but you won in part because you had an organization that finally forced the legislature's hand, and that's because you had organized and organized and organized. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my question is like, how much of your win do you think is faith-based and how much is organizing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's both. Organizing methodology is very powerful. Organizing ordinary people in a disciplined way is very powerful. Taking that time, again, we were fortunate to have an organization that had been up over 20 years up to that point, and all the experience in it. So I think you're right. I mean, that organizing is just is essential. At the same time, I don't think people would have endured through that struggle had they not had that kind of faith core that they were working out of.
That makes sense.
And so I think that, so I want to say very much both. I mean, just intertwine the two in what we do, particularly as a faith-based organization like IPL is. I think that's part of what we bring to the table too, is that, and you know, you don't have to be a person of faith to practice nonviolence. I mean, again, you know, we share those commonalities, and we share morality, and we share that. And so I think you recognize that too. But as people of faith, I think that we want to both recognize that at the same time. I think we want to hold strong, you know, bring that faith out as our quiet witness, as it were. And so it's a good question, but you know, the organizing is essential. Yeah, it wasn't like we just prayed about it, or sang songs or had liturgies. You know, we were out there systematically, you know, very methodically organizing. Yeah, and so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've been thinking that you've told a couple stories tonight that they're really inspiring, and they give hope, and they're not magic. They're basically born of a core of faith, but also some strategizing and some energy. Mm-hmm. But I'm imagining also that you've had stories that weren't quite so successful as this one. Mm-hmm. Maybe not, but what I'm seeing right now in Rhode Island, or maybe not just Rhode Island, but there's an energy that is coming forth to address some social justice issues. Mm-hmm. Climate is among them. And yesterday, a piece of legislation that has actually been a priority for some environmental groups for years actually passed in our legislature. Mm-hmm. And that's really encouraging and helpful. What it makes me think, because I am at the other end of my life now, as I look back and there are waves of energy, mm-hmm. God's hand, I'm not going to try to label it per se, but it's a combination of many things. And when I always think when we're at a high point to savor that and to celebrate, mm-hmm. to recognize that there will always be a movement down again, and we will have to, that is the nature, at least that as I see life. And I want to note that this is maybe because we've had some difficult recent years and some issues that really need deeper resolution and acknowledgement, but I see some energy coming forth, and I'm celebrating that, but I'm also aware there's a lot more to come, and it's a lot of kicking and screaming along the way, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, good thoughts. Yeah. Yeah, part of what I do is a professor in social theory. I think we're coming out of a long social, political formation or terrain that came together in the late, probably around 1968 or so. And we've been in that space. It was interesting, 1968 had a pandemic too, as did 1918. That was I think the regime or the terrain before that. And so we seem to be going in these kind of 50-year formations. I would argue that 1918 was another time that a different world formation came out, and it went through a real time of not really solidifying with the Depression and the World War II before it finally, solidified. And I think we're in the midst of that kind of transformation right now. And those transformations can go either way, as it were. We've got powerful forces trying to take it one direction and powerful forces trying to take it another direction. And we're very evenly, at least partisan-wise, split in this country, although I think with ordinary people, it may be less so. And so I think you've identified there's a lot of energy out there, and there's a lot of potentiality for some major breakthroughs on climate, major breakthroughs in racial justice, major breakthroughs on economic justice, major breakthroughs perhaps in health. And so, we've got an opportunity over the next, however many years here to move it in that direction. But again, it could go very bad too.
I hear what you're saying, that I'm not sure we're as evenly divided as some people would say we are. I think there is a greater good, even numbers wise, that recognizes that there is work to be done to take care of one another. I was thinking when you said about 1968, for me, it was the year I graduated from college, I got married. I mean, I had no idea there was any kind of epidemic of any sort at that point. Only that civil rights was coming to the fore, women's issues were on the table. I think one of the things that you said that's really hard for me, though, is talk less, listen more. Did we lose him?
Yeah.
He was frozen, and then he probably left, and he might want to reconnect or so.
Reconnect.
Or he lost internet. And DL, you're muted.
I'm watching for him. I don't see him yet.
Not yet, yeah. Maybe he lost internet or power or something.
If he doesn't come back in a minute, that might be the natural conclusion to our time together.
My question to this is, what is continuation of this talk, and what is your plan as a group? Like, is this just a talk, or?
Do you want me to, can I take a shot at that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. It just
right, you're back.
So like I say, it's been a challenge. You know, it's been a long haul. It's been a challenging time. Yeah, in fact, that victory in the 80s, I mean, if you can remember the 80s, you know, that was the heart of the Reagan era. So, you know, we were really swimming against the tide then. Yeah, and so there's just, I think, you know, one of the things that John Lewis just talks about is endurance, and the endurance that he drew on from, quoting here, I probably can't find it, but the endurance that he drew on through the Black church over generations, you know, enduring through this long, you know, the long struggle and the long suffering. So, yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah, I just would like.
I have a quick.
Okay, Martina, you go first, and then I just say something quickly.
Okay, super great. It's just to build on what you just said. It's a little follow-up question. I just feel like there's so much cynicism and anger right now. And like, I mean, it's great when you're organizing people from faith communities, but how do you cultivate that satyagraha, that soul force, when you're, you know, not necessarily organizing with people who are like, you know, have a strong spiritual practice and spiritual community and that sort of like orientation?
Yeah, we're in a very challenging place that way. And I don't entirely have the answer to that, other than when one is wanting to take this kind of approach to things, one, I think, you just want to draw into your campaign or the people that resonate with that approach, and provide that training and that approach, and that you're agreed that at least you or we are going to take that approach. It's pretty, I've not found it easy to convince people that aren't, who don't resonate with that approach. I mean, you know, they went through this in the civil rights movement too. And some of the folks that, you know, were cynical about it saw it working, so they looked at it as a tactic that worked. And, you know, and so it's a long-standing question. But within our current situation, yeah, again, I don't think you can't argue somebody into nonviolence. And so I think then you need to, you know, I'm struggling with these questions myself. I mean, they're really central, profound questions, and I don't entirely have the answers to them, other than I think you build a core of people that are dedicated to this, and that the tactical approaches that you utilize those approaches. And so maybe, you know, you have a presence within the movement. You're not entirely attempting to completely control the movement, but you have that presence. They have that nonviolence presence in the movement. And I think, again, groups like IPL can serve that kind of, approach. So.
Thank
Thank you, Dan. I thought this was just a wonderful conversation. And I think in the course of the conversation, there were several issues. I mean, you raised issues of healthcare, of energy, basic rights of access to energy. Mm-hmm. There's access to clean water we haven't talked about, and then the whole race issue, and then we have climate justice. Mm-hmm. There are so many issues, and sometimes it feels overwhelming. Mm-hmm. However, I think what we really need to change is our vision of what it means to be human and on this planet at this time. Mm-hmm. Because if we all have the well-being of what you can say the beloved community, but mm-hmm. it doesn't matter what word you use. Mm-hmm. When you have the well-being of society in mind, and then all these problems will be solved. So we need to make another leap in our spiritual development. And in the case of climate, that leap needs to encompass the whole, all of humankind. We mm-hmm. need to develop a consciousness that we are all one human family. Mm-hmm. And that the borders, the national borders, are pure human imagination, and they serve a purpose, and they are good, for organization. It's a very useful thing to have nations, but it should not divide us. Mm-hmm. So I think if we just need to change or elevate our consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I see, like in the faith communities, I see that's maybe our major task. So that's just my 2 cents. But I think DL wanted to respond to Mila, but Mila left. But I can tell her what you said.
And thank you for sharing that. So.
DL, did you want to finish with the follow-up that Mila asked about, or?
Yeah, Mila asked a question while Dan wasn't there. When Mila asked a question, DL was going to address it, but we never got back to it.
But honestly, it's not a brief answer. So I had messaged Mila and I asked her if I could follow up with her after.
Cool.
So I'll make sure I do.
Well, Martina, what do you think?
I have like 50 more questions for Dan, but I guess I'm just gonna have to email him. I don't want to keep him here till midnight.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a delight being with you. Yeah. And if you ever wanted a follow-up conversation at some point, again, that's
thank you.
Zoom allows us to do things. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry there were not more people, but hopefully some people will watch the recording and learn from that.
Yeah, it was great that so many people signed up.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully they'll get to see it. And I mean,